Shabbat Shalom and good morning to all of you. Going to take a few moments. You could put your Sidurim aside for a couple moments. Our nation, the world, provided a text or a context for a text, I should say. I often find it quite amazing that there are events taking place in the world, events taking place in our nation, events taking place around me or within me, that opens a text in a new way, in a different way. As you know, this morning we read from a double parsha. The first half of that parsha was Achrei, and the second half was Kedoshim. As we read them this week, we know that America came face to face with the conviction of a policeman for murder. Achrei, then, we stand after the death. Why was this important? Why was it so important? Seems like an obvious question, but it's taken on great importance because there are killings taking place daily by the people who should be enforcing the law and are breaking it. It was once again the murder of a black man by a white cop, and it was a murder that every one of us saw. In the message which I sent out yesterday, my Friday afternoon messages, I referenced a text from Parshat Kedoshim, which I believe was given new meaning through the events that took place. It's a verse in Kedoshim, and it perhaps may be one of the most important verses in the Torah. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, the Torah teaches us. We're commanded not to stand idly by the blood of our neighbor. We saw that this week, and we heard from many commentators that Derek Chauvin, the white policeman, would probably not have been determined guilty had there not been bystanders who decided that the way they could respond effectively was by taking video recordings on their telephones. They did something in that moment of horror. They made those videos and they shared them on their own Facebook pages, and they shared them with law enforcement, and the results were that the world saw the murder. They fulfilled an obligation from the Torah. They didn't stand idly by. I think about the difference it makes when people see things as opposed to when people hear things. In this case, we know that it was very profound because of the history of these types of events. I cannot help but think of the late President and General Dwight D. Eisenhower's request upon his visit to Buchenwald, where he encouraged those with him to photograph what they saw. He said, "The world otherwise will not believe this in a generation." And I know that every one of us, certainly all of the Jewish people, are familiar with the words of the late Reverend Martin Niemöller, who wrote a confessional poem. We know the words. The poem begins, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out." And you know how the rest of the poem goes. It's an indictment of standing idly by, an indictment of not speaking out. The end of the verse, Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, you should not stand by the blood of your neighbor, goes very simply like this, Ani Adonai. Re'echa is not your brother or sister, not the same as you. Re'echa is your neighbor, someone who's not always or fully like you. And when it says Ki Ani Adonai, it's infusing your neighbor with in your mind with the reality that God is part of every human being and every human life. Last summer, I drove north to visit my kids, and I stopped for a few days to be with my sister and brother-in-law who live in Bluffton, South Carolina. And one day we drove around the area and they showed me the beautiful little southern town of Beaufort. Very quaint little town. But we also walked by a neighborhood, and there in the neighborhood was a lynching tree, a beautiful tree, perfectly formed with a branch that went horizontally across the road. It wasn't a beautiful tree. It was an awful, awful sight to stand there and imagine what had transpired at this lynching tree. Undoubtedly, tens, if not hundreds, of slaves and ex-slaves were hung just from that particular tree. And we know that no one spoke up, no one stood up. Acts of cruelty and violence by people against their fellow human beings is a part, tragically, of the human condition and has been. Acts of racial violence has been embedded in our culture. We fear difference, and fear leads to hatred, and hatred so often leads to violence. Some have stated that a Black man reinforces guilt in the hearts of white men. We know what white men have done. There are many levels of issues, there are many causes for the reasons of hatred and racism, and they run deep. The net effect can be seen when a policeman can nonchalantly, with a hand in his pocket, lean with a knee on the neck, the throat of a Black man. We know it too well. And we have to know it not only because of our experience as Americans, but we know it from our own experiences of oppression. We know that there are systems that support hatred, anti-Semitism, and racism, and we know what they've brought. We know what they have led to. I wonder what will happen now as we progress, move on from this week. What will happen after this verdict? Will each violent act need to be fully recorded in order for us to be a nation that will fulfill its promise of justice for all? We have seen and we will see in the days and months and the years ahead responses from government officials, elected officials, from the Justice Department and police departments. And we will see reactions from the reactionaries and those who carry within them racism and hatred and resentments in their hearts. And here too, I believe there's something to learn from the Parshiot of this week. Before Parshat Kedoshim, as you know, there is Parshat Achrei Mot. Achrei Mot means literally after the deaths, and it refers to the deaths of Aaron's two sons. We read about those deaths a few weeks ago, and I want to comment on the juxtaposition and perhaps find a meaning beyond the story as it is literally read in terms of implications and responsibilities for our lives as Jews. You probably recognize the narrative, not just from reading it in the cycle of Torah readings annually, but it is the narrative which is read on the morning of Yom Kippur. It is the primary reading of the Day of Atonement and brings us back to the first sacrifices, the first acts done by the priests in the community to find forgiveness. I want to move from the specifics to a broader understanding. So it begins with Aaron, the high priest, being called to make atonement. We know the ceremony is quite elaborate. It's a ceremony that we not only read about in the Torah, but it's one that we reenact in the Avodah service on Yom Kippur afternoon. There are different offerings which are to be brought. He takes a bull. He takes 2 goats. He takes a ram. And then there are a series of these offerings that the high priest brings. Bulls and rams are slaughtered first for the sin of the priest himself. For surely he cannot ask for atonement for others until his sins are atoned for. And then for the sins of his own family. And then for the sins of the entire community. We know that Yom Kippurim comes from this idea of atonement, but also from Purim, Kippurim, and that is lots. For lots were drawn for the 2 goats, and 1 goat was slaughtered. The lucky goat receives the sins of the entire community, symbolically placed on his head through a ritualistic laying of the hands. And that goat was sent Azazel, sent out into the wilderness. In the ancient Mideast, goats carried mythical qualities. Goats carried an element of what was seen as being the demon. But it seems that through the sacrifice and through sending that goat into the wilderness, sins which were both known and both unknown were carried away. I describe this today because we have read Achrei Mot, and because we are living in a world after the death of a man who did not want any notoriety, but a man who was killed, and through his death, a nation may experience a transformation. What is clear to me that it is not because of the guilt of one police officer. We know that it's connected to something much larger. It's connected to a history of slavery, a history where hundreds, if not thousands of people of color were hung and lynched while white killers went unnoticed. It happened because of a society that so quickly was willing or simply can look the other way and then move on, but perhaps no longer, not after this death. For those of us in Florida, we know, we're reminded fairly regularly about George Zimmerman killing young and innocent Trayvon Martin. We remember. And we saw the manipulation of a law and the population as Zimmerman walked free after that murder and Trayvon lay dead. We can go through countless cases, we need not now. But rather, what I'm trying to do is to understand how Achrei Mot can speak to us. And I believe it does. Elsewhere in the Torah, there's this narrative. It's a fascinating narrative. It's about another sacrificial calf. It's called the Eglah Arufah. That calf was sacrificed by the Kohen after there was a murder of a person whose body was found dead between 2 towns. The murderer was not known. So the priest then has to make expiation for the murder. Because when there's a murder, we learn, it not only reflects the evil doings of an individual, it so often reflects much more. A family, a culture where behaviors are sometimes glossed over, a culture where gun ownership is simply so easy and random, and we see the impact of that all the time. A culture where hate speech has gone unchecked, where behaviors that destroy life are too often ignored, where those who are meant to protect us from violence become the perpetrators of violence. So who brought the sacrifices? It was the Kohanim. Vicariously, they said, I bring this offering because we are all guilty. We all share in the responsibility of the society where we find ourselves. Now, I know it's difficult to understand our role as individuals in the murder, or certainly our role in societal change. But I do know that I can vote, that I can learn, that I can read the immense amount of literature of the history of this country that we never learned before, but it's coming out in large amounts I can speak, I can teach, but something is happening. And we all have to know that. And it involves all of us. There's so much that's being written. I encourage you to immerse yourself in it. And there are those who, at the same time, are trying to limit the constitutional right to the freedom of assembly. And there are those who are attempting to increase voter suppression. We know who they are, and we know why they're doing this. We must be knowledgeable, and we must use our voices and our votes appropriately. Very few of us feel responsibility for the death of George Floyd, or the death of Dante Wright, or the death of Adam Toledo, all within the last week and a half. But maybe the message in both Achrei and Kedoshim is a message about responsibility. It's not enough that we be human beings. We have to go beyond what we would do normally. We have to be engaged more than what we think is our responsibility. We don't walk away from what we see. It takes great courage to be able to realize that each one of us as individuals play a role in this society and where we find ourselves. How could we be the ones who do not speak up? So the texts teach us that the priests bring the offering of expiation on their own behalf, their family's behalf, and behalf of all the people. That's the job of the Kohen. He brings the offering on behalf of an entire society. And here's where I make a leap. We are designated, not just as Jewish people, we're designated as Mamlechet Kohanim. We are a nation. We are a kingdom of priests. And so it forces us to ask this question. Does our own experience, our own learning, our own value system force our reckoning in this world? What does that mean? As American Jews living in freedom, participating in the society we know, you and I have to recognize that you and generations before you were on the front lines fighting for freedom and justice. Jews were amongst the leaders in the battle for workers' rights and unions. We were disproportionately counted amongst the white people in the civil rights movement. Our rabbis marched in the front lines. In the movement for women's rights and gay rights, we were disproportionately represented. Why is that? It's because it's in the fabric of our culture. It's because we are Mamlechet Kohanim. It's because of what we learn. It's because of our own experiences. It's our own Torah, our own history. It's the essence of Mamlechet Kohanim, the ones who brought the offerings. We read Kedoshim Tihiyu. God says to us, you should be holy. And as I said a few times already this morning, it's not a commandment to each one of us as individuals. It's an obligation for the people that we are a part of, the nation that we build, the nation of the Jewish people. It's a reflection of who we are and our courage to be able to stand up for what is right and just in the face of injustice. It's always really difficult when they come for someone else to stand up for them. But the answer may be found in one of the earliest questions in our Torah. You know what the question was? God asks Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain answers, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is not provided in Breshit. The answer has been provided through our experiences and through life. It's pretty clear, we are. And as the priests of long ago took responsibility for those in their community, we, Mamlechet Kohanim, are part of that culture. Those are our values. And that's what it means to be a part of the Jewish people. It means that we stand up for that which is right and that which is just. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We turn now to the Musaf service, page 155.